In 1979, Anne Atkin opened the world's first Gnome Reserve, a sanctuary which housed well over 2,000 of these often charming, sometimes bizarre garden characters. In fact, the collection was so big that in 2021 she felt she could no longer look after them all, and the gnomes were moved to the Merry Harriers Garden Centre, where they are now open to the public. Some love them, some hate them, and for some it is all a matter of taste. After all, they are banned from the famous Chelsea Flower Show. Despite this, we can't help but notice them, peeking out from behind the cracked flower pots, the length and breadth of the entire country. But have you ever wondered about their history? It's an old tale, and a strange one too, and it takes us far from the garden gates, and into a past as colourful as it is extraordinary. This is the tale of the garden gnome. In 2008, a small figure carved from mammoth ivory was discovered in the cave of Hohlefels in southwestern Germany. It's possibly the oldest representation of a humanoid figure that is known to exist, dating from at least 35,000 years old, the very beginning of the Upper Paleolithic. Its exaggerated form may suggest a type of fertility totem, possibly of a long-lost goddess, a deity depicting the very essence of life and birth. Carving images of our deities into stone, or forming them from the clay of the earth, is seen in almost all cultures in history, and the Romans in particular are well remembered for their fondness for sculpture, art, and ornate murals. I visited the city of Chester, where I could see firsthand a Roman carving of their goddess Minerva, once forming part of a temple on the outskirts of the fortress of Deva. Next to this withered image of the goddess is a small niche, thought to be an altar and used for the leaving of offerings to this well-loved deity of wisdom and justice. And here, strangely enough, is the origin of the type of garden gnomes we know today. Leaving votive offerings for the many gods and spirits of the ancient world was very common, as was the creation of such figures from stone, clay, or any natural material that one could shape and form into the images seen in the mind. One deity in particular was Priapus, a rustic god of fertility and livestock, as well as gardens and plants that bear fruit. Carved figures of him were often placed in Roman gardens, thought to watch over it and bless it with the potential for a fruitful harvest to come. In fact, the agricultural writer Columella advises all gardeners to place a figure of Priapus in the middle of their garden, and thus by paying homage to this statue, your garden was sure to be blessed by the presence of this little carved figure, half obscured by your flowers and crops. The word gnome itself, however, did not appear in literature until the 16th century, where it appeared in the writings of Swiss philosopher Paracelsus, notably his work entitled A Book on Nymphs, Sylphs, Pygmies and Salamanders, and Other Spirits. In this book, gnomes are described as earth-dwelling spirits or elemental beings, being of no more than 2 spans high and living underground. They were said to be very hesitant to interact with humans, living largely undetected in caves, warrens, and underground spaces. It is not known how Paracelsus developed these images, but he likely drew inspiration from similar entities from the ancient world, most notably the dwarves of Germanic folklore, shown often as small, skilled craftspeople, often blacksmiths, living in hollow mounds, caves, and mountains. There was also the rich pantheon of other chthonic deities, entities related to a type of underworld or dwelling place deep inside the earth, sometimes a metaphor for a crossing of worlds, like the famous tale of Persephone, abducted and married to Hades, king of the underworld. It is perhaps natural at this point of time, when customs and folklore were being immortalised in the written word, that we would create such images to personify the feeling of the deep earth and the wonders to be found within. Gnomes were often the guardians of treasures, precious stones and mines, and they lived amongst the deep roots of the trees and soil. This was undoubtedly a powerful image for agricultural communities, for whom the sowing and reaping of the earth was their entire livelihood. Gnomes may either help or hinder, blessing the harvest like those early invocations of the Roman Priapus, while at the same time keeping secret the hidden places and mysteries of the earth. The more caves, warrens and escarpments a place had, the more likely it would be to be home to folk tales about creatures like gnomes living within. I had visited some of these places to help understand these early days, long before gnomes took over our gardens. My first port of call was the so-called Devil's Parlour, a narrow and almost inaccessible cave, said once to be the home of small, goblin-like beings, for whom the locals would sometimes leave offerings, in return for good harvests. The scent of the earth was strong, and the roots of trees could be seen pushing through some of the stone and wet soil. I spent some time taking it all in, and it was such a silent and eerie place that it seemed like no surprise that for those who chanced upon it, it may be seen as the entryway to the home of such a being. Nearby this cave, I visited another, this one with a less obvious connection, but with an ancient stone said to be the site of druid or nature worship. Strangely enough, there was a geocache hidden inside, a record of people of whom had passed by this remote place, like a modern version of the votive offerings left for Minerva at Chester, and a little bit like buried treasure, the very thing protected by the gnomes. The final cave I visited was almost ruined due to a violent storm, but we struggled upwards to a rugged and isolated mountaintop, where sheer drops and rough, sharp escarpments made for a dangerous and difficult climb. At the top, though, was an ancient cave, the home of many folk tales both ancient and modern. Inside was yet another geocache, names scrawled in pen of passers-by, who decided to brave the climb simply to visit this hollow, wet, and inhospitable cavern. Perhaps then the veneration of gnomes was something very human. We even today feel like leaving a little offering at these places, a note to say we were there, we have felt the presence of the deep earth, stepped inside it. Those early writings of Paracelsus and others seemed not too distant at all, when the atmospheres, scents and sensations of these caves could not help but leave one with the feeling of not being alone, but of being accompanied by the spirit of the earth, maybe even the gnomes themselves. By the time the 18th century arrived, the gnome, and the mythology that went along with it, was beginning to change. Back in the Renaissance years, it had become fashionable amongst the wealthy to place stone ornaments known as grotesques into their gardens, with certain figures such as Gobby, designed by Baroque printmaker Jacques Calotte, beginning to resemble the shapes and eccentricities of the gnomes to follow. These fashions of wealthy people caught on, so that by the later half of the 18th century, gnome-like ornaments made from stone, wood, and ceramics had become popular in all walks of life and all across Europe. Germany in particular saw a growing appetite for such garden figures, as they were easily consolidated with the wide folklore of dwarves and similar entities, so that by owning one of these figures, you may bring the blessings of these spirits into your dwelling or garden. In fact, many believe that the first recognisable garden gnomes were produced in Germany from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with companies like Dresden's Bayer and Maresch stocking dwarves and little folk to place in your garden, as well as the later productions by Peter Griebel and August Heisner, of whose gnomes became very well known and sought after all over the world. They were made in the village of Grafenrode, styled as the birthplace of the garden gnome, and these wonderful early works were certainly a monumental part of the look, feel, and popularity of the gnome. They had reached Britain in the 1840s, where in 1847 Sir Charles Isham purchased 21 garden gnomes from Peter Griebel's factory in Germany, and he installed them at his home, Lamport House in Northamptonshire. Like many of the early adopters of these new garden companions, Isham genuinely believed in fairies and gnomes, and was convinced that in the dark of the night they came to life and worked in the nearby caves. He even wrote a book about it, Notes on Gnomes, where he chronicled the reports of many in the community of whom claimed to have seen and had encounters with these gnomes. When Sir Charles died, his daughters removed the gnomes, with some legends claiming that they were so unhappy with the creatures that they shot them with rifles. One possible origin of a well-loved episode of comedy One Foot in the Grave, where Victor looks after hundreds of gnomes, only to have his neighbour open fire on them.
You better wave goodbye to your garden gnomes.
Luckily, one of Isham's garden gnomes survived this massacre, allegedly falling through a crevice and being discovered many years later. It is now displayed within the house itself, is known as Lampy, and is insured for over £1 million. And there was something else going on as well, in the English country gardens all over the country, around this same time. Thought to be inspired by Francis of Paola, an Italian mendicant of whom lived as a hermit in a cave on his father's estate, the garden fashions of the landed gentry soon turned to what would become known as the ornamental hermit. One would build a small stone grotto, sometimes with a table and chair or simple bed, creating the illusion that a hermit could be living upon your land. After all, escaping from the new world of industry into a quiet retreat had become something of a luxury of which many aspired to, with many Victorian explorers rediscovering the quiet spaces of the world, like the caves I visited earlier, where the original folk stories were first crafted. For some, though, the mere suggestion of a hermit on your land was not enough. They wanted the real thing, and some landowners would actually hire hermits to live in their grottos, often with instructions not to wash, to grow their hair or nails, and be available to entertain and speak to their visitors. In return for living as a kind of real-life garden ornament, the ornamental hermit would be paid a small sum of money, as well as room and board. It may have been a rather strange life. On one hand, it was easy work, with guaranteed pay, and on the other, you were expected to live as a kind of garden novelty, your sole employment being living in a small stone grotto in the garden, and looking the part. For most, though, without access to vast estates of where one could build a grotto and employ a hermit, the garden gnome was growing ever more popular with each passing year. when English lawyer Frank Crisp opened up his garden estate for visitors. They found inside not an ornamental hermit, but a huge collection of garden gnomes. In fact, the second biggest collection in the whole of the country. During this time, the public were introduced, sometimes for the very first time, to the sometimes funny, always eccentric world of these little gnomes. And of course, many would leave with a strong desire to purchase one for themselves. The popularity of the garden gnome seemed like it would never end, but that is not to say that it was always an easy journey. The First World War saw not only the production of gnomes slow down, but the desirability of German-made gnomes declined in much of Europe. And since the best of them all still came from those early factories like Grafenrode, the slow production and reluctance to purchase them could well have spelled the end for the garden gnome. That was until 1937, when Walt Disney Productions released their first feature film, and the first full-length film to be made entirely from animation, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, based on the fairy tale from the Brothers Grimm, was an important and hugely successful moment in the history of animation and cinema. Furthermore, it brought garden gnomes back into the minds of a post-war world, with new gnomes painted in brighter colours than ever before, mimicking the cute and endearing look of the much beloved Seven Dwarfs. Around this time, Tom Major Ball, the father of later Prime Minister John Major, founded Major's Garden Ornaments, of which became one of the most prolific producers of garden gnomes in the UK. Interest in fairy worlds and associated beings had experienced a renaissance in the post-war years, and the new-look, colourful garden gnomes were an easy and increasingly affordable way to bring a smile into your garden and remind you of the beauties of nature to be found by simply stepping outside. Sadly, production and interest in gnomes declined again during the Second World War, this time with most manufacturers ceasing to create them entirely, turning their skills instead to the war effort. Was the garden gnome finally finished? Destined to be remembered as a quirky part of a carefree past, no longer desirable or needed in this new era of global conflict? Of course, it was not to be so. By the 1970s, gnomes were once again growing hugely in popularity, this time helped by new manufacturing methods creating cheaper and more eccentric designs. Gnomes could now be produced in plastic and resin, allowing for brighter, lighter, and more hard-wearing nature than their heavy stone and fragile terracotta ancestors. They became a popular scene in suburban gardens everywhere you went, with humorous and novel designs meaning there was something to appeal to each and every gardener. Many don't even know why they first decided to purchase a garden gnome, but many have found that once they start, they don't quite know when to stop. In fact, it was around this time when Anne Atkin first started collecting garden gnomes, to later become the Gnome Reserve. And she was not alone in feeling a strange urge to collect, cherish, and even identify with these creatures. Ron Broomfield actually lived as a gnome every Wednesday, dressing up and going about his usual business, as well as getting to work repairing, painting, and collecting the creatures, of which, until his death in 2015, he owned almost as many as gnome record holder Anne Atkin.
When I dress up as a gnome, I become a gnome, but the rest of my time, if I'm in my ordinary clothes going around, I forget all about being a gnome. People ask me about gnomes, say, no, not today. You look at gnomes, they're always happy, go lucky. They work very hard when everyone else is asleep. Gnome comes to life at night time. And when you think that people say they're talking to the plants in the garden, they're not actually talking to the plants in the garden to be looked after. They're talking to the gnomes who are sleeping under the plants. And at the night time they come alive.
Despite this dedication to gnomes, and their undoubted place in the many thousands of gardens all around the world, they are not universally adored, even amongst gardening enthusiasts. Garden gnomes have been banned at the famous Chelsea Flower Show ever since its earliest days, with the Royal Horticultural Society claiming that, and I quote, "Gnomes detract from the presentation of the plants and products on display, and from the general appearance of the show." If this sounds harsh, the gnomes thought so too, or at least their thousands of enthusiasts did, of whom have staged gnome protests at the show, lining up garden gnomes like a picket in demonstration against these accusations of snobbery and bad taste. All was not lost, however, as for 1 year only, the garden gnome was finally allowed inside this most coveted horticultural show, the ban temporarily lifted for the centenary event, where the gnomes finally took over the flower displays. Gnomes get everywhere, it seems. One was even visible, if you looked closely enough, on the cover of the Beatles' famous Sgt. Pepper album. This small cardboard gnome, of which was signed by the Fab Four, was sold at auction in 2015 for the sum of £29,000. No matter if you love them or hate them, there is no denying the immense staying power of the humble garden gnome. So what is it exactly that fascinates us about these garden gnomes? For most owners, they are quite possibly unaware of their folklore and mystical origins, but they still feel something draws them to these creatures, of which you can't escape from, even today. You can find them in seemingly all walks of life, from TV shows and movies, to, of course, every single garden centre. Perhaps that is it. If we are unaware of their origins, it probably doesn't matter, for these gnomes really are making us aware of the green earth around us, watching over the flowers and gardens that we so lovingly tend. After all, visit one of these garden centres, with the hundreds of plants, seeds and garden furniture, and it's likely that you will feel something of a desire to connect with a green and pleasant land. It's the world of the garden party, a hazy memory of long-lost summer times. We all love to landscape and spend time in our gardens, no matter their size, our own private spaces of natural beauty. And in this regard, gnomes really are the guardian spirits of the place, just like with the Romans and their statues of Priapus. Somehow, our garden gnomes seem to embody that same feeling, just like our early ancestors tried to capture the fertility and spirit of their own concepts and ideas by forming them from bone or clay. We're connected too with those deep roots of the earth, and we can do it with the help of our smiling, fishing and relaxing garden gnome. And with so many different types of gnomes on the market, you're sure to find something that appeals to you, even if you never liked gnomes to begin with. After all, they can be a lot of fun, like the travelling gnomes phenomena where one brings a gnome on a trip and photographs it outside various famous landmarks. Why would you do this? For no other reason than the fact that it's quirky, odd, and brings a smile to people's faces. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't still a strange side to them as well. In 1979, a group of school children were sent for a walk in Wetton Park in Nottingham. Multiple children reported seeing small cars driven by gnome drivers, in a strange experience which allegedly lasted for around 15 minutes. The gnomes reportedly chased the children around the park before they eventually escaped onto the street, the gnomes refusing to leave the boundaries of the park. This experience, although it might sound fanciful, is actually interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was very well documented, with multiple interviews of different witnesses taken very soon after the incident. Also, it was not the first time that such entities had been reported in the same area, with boggarts, ghost lights, and other strange experiences, all reported around Wetton Park. Folklorists have long had a fascination with this case, of which has become known as the Wetton Gnomes, and it has become regarded as one of the most famous modern sightings of fae folk, nature deities, and gnomes. So does this mean that the gnomes actually exist, after all? The Wetton encounter is certainly not the only time that people have had encounters with strange things, of which they have only really described as being real-life gnomes. After all, they have become a mainstay of nature belief and worship ever since the earliest days, and they connect with the popular ideas of grounding and earth-centered spirituality, of which is more popular than ever today. But if that kind of thing doesn't float your boat, then don't worry about it, because if the garden gnome makes you smile, brings some colour and cheer to the garden, and helps you create a fun and vibrant space in the earth, then it's done its job, whether it exists or not. Really, if you haven't got a garden gnome, you should wait for the credits to roll on this documentary, and then go out and buy one. You might not be allowed to take it to the Chelsea Flower Show, but it will almost certainly brighten up your flower beds, and with it, you are connecting to a long and ancient tradition of honouring the green earth and all of its wonders, and bringing a little bit of joy to your home and garden at the same time.